Have you ever felt like you knew everything about someone you loved, only to discover you knew nothing at all? I'm asking because that's exactly what happened to me on what should have been just another painful anniversary, another quiet moment of grief at my daughter's grave, another year of whispering to the cold stone that holds her name. But this time, everything I thought I knew about my daughter's life shattered in an instant, and I'm still picking up the pieces, still trying to understand how the person I raised, the girl I watched grow into a woman, could have an entire secret world I never even glimpsed. My name doesn't matter, but my story does, because it's about love and loss and the devastating beauty of discovering that even in death, the people we cherish can still surprise us, still teach us, still break our hearts in ways we never imagined possible. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I make the same journey to Riverside Cemetery, carrying fresh lilies because those were always her favorite, the white ones that smell like summer even in the cold months. And I sit on the bench beneath the oak tree and I talk to her like she's still here, like she can still hear me complaining about the neighbor's dog or telling her about the book I'm reading or admitting how much I miss her voice, her laugh, the way she used to call me every Sunday. Morning without fail. It's been 7 years since the accident, 7 years since that phone call that split my life into before and after. 7 years of learning to breathe through the pain that never quite goes away. It just becomes familiar, like an old injury that aches when the weather changes. She was only 28 when she died, my beautiful Sarah, with her whole life ahead of her, with dreams she never got to fulfill and places she never got to see and conversations we never got to have. And sometimes I wonder if the grief ever stops feeling so raw, so immediate, like it just happened yesterday instead of 7 years ago. I always visit alone because my husband passed 2 years before Sarah did, and we had no other children, so it's just me now. Just me and my memories, and the overwhelming silence of a house that used to be full of laughter and arguments, and the everyday chaos of family life. The cemetery is usually quiet on weekday mornings, which is when I prefer to go, when there are fewer people around, and I can have my private moments with my daughter without feeling self-conscious about the tears that always come, no matter how many years pass. No matter how much I tell myself I should be stronger by now. I know every crack in her headstone, every letter of her name carved into the granite, every inch of the plot where she rests. And I've memorized the other graves nearby, the elderly couple to her left who died within months of each other, the young soldier to her right who never came home from war. All these stories of lives cut short or lives well lived. All these people who were loved and are now mourned. But this particular morning, this anniversary that should have been like all the others, I noticed something different before I even reached Sarah's grave, and my heart started pounding in a way that felt almost like panic, because there was someone there, someone kneeling at my daughter's headstone, someone who had no right to be in my sacred space, interrupting my private ritual of grief. As I got closer, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path, I could see it was a woman, probably in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was crying, actually weeping in a way that shook her whole body. And beside her was a child, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with curly brown hair and these enormous eyes that seemed too wise for such a young face. The woman had her hand pressed against Sarah's headstone like she was trying to feel something through the cold stone, and the boy was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind kids pick from fields without really knowing what they are, just knowing they're pretty and colorful and might make someone happy. I stood there frozen, completely unable to process what I was seeing, because in 7 years of visiting this grave, I had never encountered anyone else there, never seen evidence that anyone besides me remembered my daughter, cared about her enough to visit, thought about her enough to cry. My first emotion was anger, if I'm being completely honest, because how dare this stranger intrude on my grief? How dare she bring a child to cry at my daughter's grave like she had any right to be there, like she knew Sarah, like she had earned the privilege of mourning her. I almost turned around and left, almost decided to come back another day when I could have my privacy back. But something stopped me. Maybe curiosity, maybe the way the little boy was looking at the headstone with such solemn concentration, like he was trying to understand something too complicated for his young mind to fully grasp. I cleared my throat, not aggressively but loud enough to announce my presence, and the woman's head jerked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying, mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark rivers, and there was something in her expression that I couldn't quite identify. Something that looked almost like fear mixed with recognition mixed with resignation, like she had been expecting me but hoping I wouldn't come. She stood up quickly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, and pulled the little boy closer to her side in a protective gesture that mothers everywhere would recognize. And I felt my anger soften just slightly, because I understood that instinct, that need to shield your child from anything that might hurt them, even if that something is just a confused old woman at a cemetery. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and I could see she was trying to decide whether to run or stay, whether to explain herself or remain silent, and I realized I needed to say something, needed to break this terrible tension that was building between us like a storm about to break. So I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be, that this was my daughter's grave, that I came here every year on this day, and I asked who she was, why she was here, what possible connection she could have to Sarah that would bring her to tears at this gravestone. The woman took a deep breath, the kind you take when you're about to jump off a cliff or confess something terrible or change everything with your next words, and she said something that made the entire world tilt sideways, made my knees go weak, made everything I thought I knew about my daughter's life crumble into dust. She said, her voice barely above a whisper, that Sarah was the love of her life, that they had been together for 3 years before the accident, that this little boy standing beside her, this child with the wildflowers and the solemn eyes, was my grandson. I actually laughed, which sounds cruel, but it was pure shock, pure disbelief, because my daughter wasn't gay. My daughter had never mentioned a woman. My daughter had dated boys in high school and college and had never, not once, given me any indication that she was interested in women, and certainly had never told me she was in a serious relationship, and absolutely had never mentioned that she had a child, that I had a grandchild, that this fundamental piece of information about my own family had been kept from me. The woman, whose name I still didn't know, just stood there letting me process, letting me work through the denial and confusion and hurt, and the little boy was watching me with those big eyes. And I could see it now. I could see Sarah in the shape of his face, in the curve of his smile, in the way he tilted his head slightly to the left when he was concentrating, exactly the way my daughter used to do when she was thinking hard about something. My legs actually gave out and I sat down hard on the bench, the same bench I always sat on, and I put my head in my hands because this was too much, too overwhelming, too impossible to understand. And I could hear the woman saying something about being sorry, about wanting to tell me, about Sarah making her promise not to, and I wanted to scream at her that none of this made sense, that my daughter told me everything, that we were close, that she wouldn't have hidden something this huge from me. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Knew that Sarah had become more distant in the last few years of her life, that our phone calls had become shorter and less frequent, that she had stopped coming home for holidays as often, always with excuses about work or travel or things she needed to take care of. And I had told myself it was normal, that adult children need their independence, that I shouldn't be clingy or demanding, that I should give her space to live her life. The woman sat down beside me on the bench, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that I could smell her perfume, something floral and light, and she started talking in this quiet, steady voice, telling me things about my daughter that I had never known, painting a picture of Sarah's life that was completely foreign to me, and yet somehow felt true in a way that made my chest ache with a grief that felt fresh and new all over again. She told me her name was Rachel, that she had met Sarah at a conference for environmental scientists because they were both passionate about climate change and conservation, and they had started talking at a cocktail hour and hadn't stopped for 6 hours, sitting in the hotel lobby long after everyone else had gone to bed, discussing everything from ocean acidification to their favorite childhood books to their deepest fears about the future. She said Sarah had been afraid to tell me about their relationship because she wasn't sure how I would react, because I had made comments over the years about wanting grandchildren and asking when she was going to settle down with a nice man, because Sarah worried that coming out would disappoint me, or change how I saw her, or create a rift between us that she wasn't willing to risk. And I wanted to protest, wanted to insist that I would have loved and accepted her no matter what, that my love was unconditional, that she should have known she could trust me with her truth. But I sat there silent, because somewhere deep down, in the honest part of my heart that I usually avoid examining too closely, I wondered if Sarah had been right to be afraid, if my reaction would have been as open and accepting as I wanted to believe it would have been. Rachel told me that when Sarah got pregnant, it had been planned, that they had used a sperm donor and gone through the whole process together, reading every book about pregnancy and childbirth, attending every doctor's appointment, painting the nursery in their apartment a soft green color that Sarah insisted would be calming for the baby. She showed me a photo on her phone of Sarah, my daughter, heavily pregnant and glowing with happiness, standing in what must have been their home with her hands on her belly and the biggest smile I had ever seen on her face. And I realized I had never seen her look that joyful, that completely at peace. And it hurt more than I can describe to know that this massive, beautiful, life-changing experience had happened without me, that I had missed it entirely, that my daughter had grown a human, being inside her body, and I hadn't been there to hold her hand or help her pick out baby clothes or throw her a shower or do any of the things mothers are supposed to do when their daughters are having children. The little boy, whose name was Oliver, Rachel told me, had been born 6 months before the accident, which meant Sarah had kept him hidden from me for half a year, had presumably been planning to eventually tell me but had run out of time, had died before she could bridge that gap between her secret life and her life with me. I looked at Oliver, really looked at him, and I could see Sarah everywhere in his features, in the way he pursed his lips when he was thinking, in the dimple in his left cheek, in the exact shade of his eyes, which were the same honey brown as my daughter's, as mine, as my late husband's. A family trait passed down through generations, now living on in this child I had never met. Rachel explained that after Sarah died, she had wanted to contact me immediately, had wanted to reach out and share the grief and tell me about Oliver, but Sarah had made her promise, had actually written it down in a document they had drawn up together, that if anything ever happened to her, Rachel should not tell me about Oliver unless I seemed open to it, unless the circumstances felt right, because Sarah was terrified that I would try to take Oliver away, would argue that Rachel had no legal right to him since they hadn't been married and her name wasn't on the birth certificate, would involve lawyers and courts and make everything ugly and painful. And I wanted to be offended by this assumption, wanted to insist that I would never do such a thing, but I understood it too, understood that grief makes people do irrational things, that the law often doesn't protect non-traditional families, that Rachel's fear had been reasonable, even if it broke my heart to think my daughter had seen me as a potential threat to her family's stability. For 7 years, Rachel had been raising my grandson alone, working full-time as an environmental consultant while managing daycare pickups and bedtime stories and all the exhausting, beautiful chaos of single parenthood, and she had brought Oliver to Sarah's grave every year on the anniversary of her death, teaching him about the mother he would never remember, showing him photos and videos, telling him stories about how funny and smart and kind Sarah had been, keeping her memory alive in their small family of 2. She said Oliver knew he had a grandmother somewhere, that Sarah had told him stories about me before she died, about how I made the best chocolate chip cookies and could name every constellation in the night sky, and had once driven 6 hours in a snowstorm to pick Sarah up from college when she had the flu. But Rachel had never given him my name or contact information because she was honoring Sarah's wishes, protecting her family the only way she knew how. I asked Rachel why she had decided to come to the grave at the same time as me this year, why she had broken her pattern of visiting separately, and she admitted that it wasn't intentional, that they usually came in the evening, but Oliver had been asking more questions lately about his grandmother, about whether he would ever meet me, about whether I knew he existed, and Rachel had decided that maybe it was time, that maybe Sarah's fears had been excessive, that maybe 7 years was long, enough to keep this secret. She said she had been planning to leave before I arrived, but I had come earlier than usual, and when she heard my footsteps on the path, she had frozen, unable to decide whether to stay or flee, and then I was there, and the decision had been made for her. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the enormity of what had just been revealed, both of us grieving in our own ways for the woman we had both loved, the woman who had kept us separated out of fear and love, and the complicated calculations people make when they're trying to protect themselves and the people they care about. Oliver was still standing by the gravestone, carefully arranging his wildflowers in the small vase that I always kept there for my lilies, and I watched him move with such gentle concentration, such obvious care, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, some wall I had built around my heart to protect it from more pain, more loss, more disappointment. This child was my family, my blood, my daughter's legacy, and I had been living 5 miles away from him for his entire life without knowing he existed, without getting to be part of his childhood, without getting to teach him the things I had taught Sarah, without getting to love him the way grandmothers are supposed to love their grandchildren. I stood up from the bench, my legs shaky but holding, and I walked slowly toward Oliver, not wanting to frighten him but needing to be closer to him, needing to see my daughter's face in his more clearly. He looked up at me with curiosity, but no fear, and I knelt down beside him, feeling my knees protest against the hard ground, and I asked him in a voice that barely worked if I could help him arrange the flowers. He nodded, solemn and serious, and handed me a bright yellow flower that might have been a dandelion or might have been something more exotic, I couldn't tell. And together we placed it in the vase, our hands almost touching, and I could feel the warmth of his small fingers, and I wanted to cry, but I held it back because I didn't want to scare him with the intensity of my emotions. He told me in that sweet, high-pitched voice that all young children have, that his mama Rachel said his mommy Sarah was the bravest person she ever knew, that she loved animals and trees and making the world better, and that she had loved him more than anything in the whole universe, even before he was born, even when he was still tiny inside her tummy. I told him that was absolutely true, that his mommy had always been brave and kind and determined to make a difference, and that I could tell just by looking at him that she would be so proud of the person he was becoming. He asked me who I was, and I glanced back at Rachel, who was watching us with tears streaming down her face, and she gave me the smallest nod, and I took a deep breath and told Oliver the truth that changed both of our lives forever. I told him I was his grandmother, his mommy Sarah's mom, and that I had been looking for him without even knowing he existed, that I had been waiting to meet him for his whole life even though I hadn't known I was waiting. The understanding that crossed his face was immediate and profound, and he asked me if I was the grandma who made the best cookies, and I laughed through my tears and said yes. Yes, I was that grandma, and he asked if he could call me grandma, and I said of course. Of course he could. He could call me anything he wanted, and he very seriously told me that he would call me Grandma Sarah's mom because that way he would always remember that I was connected to the mommy he never got to really know. Have you ever experienced a moment where your entire world shifts on its axis, where everything you thought you understood about your life suddenly looks completely different? That's what was happening to me in that moment. Kneeling beside my grandson at my daughter's grave, feeling the full weight of 7 years of missed birthdays and first days of school, and lost time that I could never get back, but also feeling this overwhelming rush of love and possibility and hope that maybe, just maybe, this devastating discovery could become something beautiful. Rachel came and stood beside us, and the three of us were there together, 3 generations connected by loss and love, and the complicated legacy of a woman who had tried to protect everyone but had ended up creating a situation that hurt us all in different ways. I wasn't angry anymore, or maybe I was still angry, but it was mixed with so many other emotions that I couldn't separate them, couldn't identify where the anger ended and the grief began and the joy started. I asked Rachel if we could talk more, if she would be willing to meet me for coffee or come to my house, or let me take them both to dinner. Anything that would give us a chance to figure out what happened next, how we were going to navigate this impossible situation we found ourselves in. She agreed, cautiously but sincerely, and we exchanged phone numbers right there in the cemetery, standing over Sarah's grave like she was witnessing this moment, like she was somehow orchestrating it from wherever she was now, bringing together the people she had loved most in the world, even though she had kept them separated in life. Oliver asked if he could visit me soon, if I would teach him to make cookies like I taught his mommy, and I promised him I would. I would teach him everything I knew. I would tell him all the stories about his mother that Rachel couldn't tell because she hadn't known Sarah as a child, hadn't seen her grow up, hadn't watched her become the amazing woman she had been. We stayed at the grave for another hour, the 3 of us, talking and crying and laughing occasionally when someone shared a funny memory. And I learned more about my daughter in that hour than I had known in the last 5 years of her life. Learned about her passion for renewable energy, about her terrible singing voice that she refused to acknowledge, about her habit of rescuing injured animals and nursing them back to health in their apartment, much to Rachel's amused exasperation. I told them stories too, about Sarah as a little girl who was convinced she could talk to birds, about the time she organized a neighborhood recycling program when she was only 10 years old, about her determination to save the world even when she was too small to reach the kitchen counter without a step stool. Oliver listened with rapt attention, soaking up every detail about the mother he would only know through other people's memories, and I could see him building a picture of her in his mind, creating a version of Sarah that was part Rachel's love, and part my motherly pride, and part his own imagination filling in the gaps. When we finally left the cemetery, walking together toward the parking lot, I felt fundamentally changed, like I had entered the gates as one person and was leaving as someone entirely different, someone who had a grandson, someone who had just discovered that her daughter had lived a whole life she knew nothing about, someone who had to reconcile the Sarah she thought she knew with the Sarah who had actually existed. Rachel had parked near me, almost like fate had positioned us to meet this way. And before we separated to our respective cars, I did something that surprised even me. I hugged her, pulling her into my arms and holding her tight, and I thanked her for taking care of my daughter, for loving her, for giving her happiness in the years I had apparently been too wrapped up in my own assumptions to really see her. And I thanked her most of all for raising Oliver, for keeping Sarah's memory alive, for being brave enough to stay at that grave even when she knew I was coming, even when it would have been easier to run. She hugged me back just as tightly, and I could feel her shoulders shaking with sobs, and I realized she had been carrying this alone for so long, this grief, and this responsibility, and this fear, and maybe, just maybe, we could carry it together now, could share the burden and the joy of loving this little boy who was all we had left of the woman we had both loved. Oliver hugged my legs, wrapping his small arms around my knees, and I stroked his curly hair, so much like Sarah's had been when she was his age, and I made a silent promise to my daughter that I would do better. I would be better. I would love this child and this woman who had been her chosen family. I would honor the life Sarah had built even though it wasn't the life I had imagined for her. The drive home was a blur of emotions and thoughts tumbling over each other faster than I could process them, and I kept glancing at my phone sitting in the passenger seat, at Rachel's number saved in my contacts, at this tangible proof that the morning's surreal encounter had actually happened and wasn't just some grief-induced hallucination. My house felt different when I walked through the door, emptier somehow even though nothing had physically changed, because now I knew what I was missing, knew that I should have had 7 years of crayon drawings on my refrigerator and toys scattered across my living room floor, and sticky handprints on my windows, and all the beautiful chaos that comes with grandchildren. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Sarah's old room, which I had kept exactly the way she left it the last time she visited, with her high school swimming trophies on the shelf and her favorite books still lined up by her bed and posters of marine life covering the walls. I looked at everything with new eyes, searching for clues I had missed, signs that my daughter had been hiding something, but there was nothing obvious, nothing that screamed secrets or deception, just the ordinary artifacts of a life lived partially in my presence and partially somewhere else, somewhere I hadn't been invited. I thought about all the conversations we had had in those last 3 years of her life, trying to remember if she had ever mentioned Rachel, even in passing, even as a friend or colleague, and I couldn't recall a single instance, which meant she had been actively careful to keep that part of her life separate, had been deliberately protecting her chosen family from me, from my questions, from my potential judgment or interference. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when I'm overwhelmed and need to feel close to Sarah. I pulled out the boxes of photos and videos I had saved, the digital archive of her life from birth to the last time I saw her, about 8 months before the accident, when she had stopped by for a quick lunch and had seemed distracted and distant, and I had attributed it to work stress without digging deeper, without asking the questions that might have led to real answers. I looked at every photo with this new context, with the knowledge that during many of these images, she had been carrying secrets, building a life I knew nothing about, falling in love and planning a family and making huge decisions without me. There was a video from her college graduation where she looked genuinely happy, laughing with friends, and I wondered if she had already met Rachel by then, if the distance I had noticed starting around that time was because she was falling in love and didn't know how to tell me. There were photos from family holidays where I could see her smile not quite reaching her eyes, and I wondered if she was thinking about Rachel, wishing she could bring her home, frustrated by the necessity of keeping such a huge part of herself hidden. The more I looked, the more I could see the signs I had missed, the subtle pulling away, the careful curation of what she shared with me, the growing gap between who she was and who I thought she was, and I felt this crushing wave of regret for not being the kind of mother she felt safe being honest with, for not creating an environment where she could trust me with her truth. Rachel texted me the next morning, asking if I was okay, if I needed time to process everything before we talked more, and I appreciated the consideration but told her no. I didn't want to wait. I had already lost 7 years, and I didn't want to lose another day. We arranged to meet at a park near my house, a place with playgrounds where Oliver could play while Rachel and I talked, and I arrived early, anxious and nervous and terrified that I was going to say the wrong thing or scare them away or somehow mess up this fragile second chance I had been given. When they arrived, Oliver ran to me immediately, calling out Grandma Sarah's mom in that unself-conscious way children have, and other people in the park turned to look and smile at this sweet moment of connection, and I felt a fierce pride mixed with sorrow that this was our first real meeting as grandmother and grandson, that we were starting 7 years late. I had brought my old photo albums, the physical ones from before everything went digital, Because I wanted to show Oliver pictures of his mother as a child. Wanted him to see the progression from baby to toddler to teenager to adult. Wanted him to understand the full scope of who she had been before he was born. We spread out on a picnic blanket I had brought, and Rachel and I took turns pointing out photos and telling stories, and Oliver was absolutely absorbed, asking a million questions about everything he saw, wanting to know what Sarah was doing in each picture, what she was thinking, whether she was happy, whether she ever got in trouble, whether she liked the same things he liked. Rachel told me more about their life together, about the apartment they had shared in the city, about Sarah's work with a nonprofit focused on ocean conservation, about their weekend ritual of cooking elaborate breakfasts and reading the newspaper and arguing playfully about whose turn it was to do the dishes. She showed me more photos and videos on her phone, including one that made me simultaneously laugh and cry, of Sarah singing a terrible off-key lullaby to infant Oliver while dancing around their living room, her face alight with pure joy and exhaustion in that way new mothers have. I watched my daughter in this video, this woman who was completely familiar and completely foreign, and I mourned all over again for the loss of her, for the grandmother I would have been if I had known about Oliver from the beginning, for the relationship Rachel and I might have had if Sarah had trusted us enough to bring us together. But I was also grateful, desperately grateful, that Rachel had captured these moments, that somewhere in her grief and struggle, she had thought to preserve these memories, to document Oliver's early life with his mother, even though Sarah's time with him had been heartbreakingly brief. I asked Rachel if I could have copies of some of the photos and videos, and she immediately started airdropping them to me right there in the park, and I watched my phone fill up with images of my daughter's secret life, with proof of her happiness and love and the family she had built. We talked about logistics too, about the practical realities of integrating me into Oliver's life, and Rachel was surprisingly open to it despite the years of separation and secrets. She said Oliver deserved to know his grandmother, to have as much family as possible, and that Sarah would have wanted this eventually, would have found the courage to tell me if she had lived long enough. We agreed to start slowly, with regular visits and phone calls, building a relationship gradually rather than trying to force an instant bond. Rachel also, with visible nervousness, asked if I would be willing to hear about her relationship with Sarah from her perspective, to understand the love they had shared and the life they had planned. And I said yes, absolutely yes, because Rachel was the person who had known my daughter best in those final years, who had seen sides of Sarah I had never seen, who could give me back pieces of my daughter I thought were lost forever. She told me about their first date, a hiking trip where Sarah had talked nonstop about climate science, and Rachel had pretended to understand even though environmental consulting was different from environmental science, and she was lost within the first 15 minutes. But she had loved Sarah's passion, loved the way her whole face lit up when she talked about the things she cared about. She told me about their first Christmas together, how Sarah had been so nervous about doing traditions right because Rachel came from a big family with specific holiday rituals, and how they had compromised by creating their own traditions that honored both their backgrounds. She told me about the day they decided to have a baby, how Sarah had cried with happiness and terror in equal measure, how they had held hands during the insemination procedure, and how Sarah had taken approximately 50 pregnancy tests before she believed she was actually pregnant. The more Rachel talked, the more I realized that my daughter had been happy, truly deeply happy, in a way I had never fully seen when she was alive. Yes, she had been keeping secrets from me. Yes, she had built a wall between her life with Rachel and her life with me, but she had also found love and purpose and created a family that brought her joy. And wasn't that what every parent wants for their child, even if it looks different than they imagined? I told Rachel about my regrets, about the comments I had made over the years that Sarah might have interpreted as judgment, about my assumptions about her life and her future that probably made her feel like she couldn't be honest with me. And Rachel listened without defensiveness or anger. And then she said something that helped more than she probably realized. She said Sarah had loved me deeply, had talked about me often, had wanted desperately to tell me about their relationship, but had been paralyzed by fear of disappointing me or changing our relationship in ways she couldn't predict or control. Rachel said Sarah's reluctance wasn't about not trusting me with the truth, but about not trusting herself to handle my reaction, whatever it might be, and that the secret had weighed on Sarah constantly, had been a source of stress and guilt that she carried right up until the accident. Knowing that Sarah had wanted to tell me, that she had struggled with the decision rather than making it casually, somehow made it hurt less, made it feel less like rejection, and more like fear, and fear I could understand, fear I could forgive. Fear made sense in a way that deliberate deception never would have. Over the following weeks, I saw Oliver and Rachel regularly, building routines and traditions of our own. And I watched my grandson open up to me, slowly starting to trust that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was a permanent fixture in his life now. I taught him to bake chocolate chip cookies, Sarah's favorite recipe that my mother had taught me, and I had taught Sarah. And I watched him measure ingredients with his small hands and crack eggs with intense concentration, and I felt this overwhelming sense of continuity, of family legacy passing down through generations despite the gaps and losses. He told me about his school and his friends and his favorite dinosaurs and all the ordinary details of his life that I had missed, and I soaked up every word like I was dying of thirst and he was offering me water. Rachel and I developed our own relationship too, separate from our shared love of Sarah and Oliver, and I found that I genuinely liked her, admired her strength and her dedication to keeping Sarah's memory alive, and her willingness to let me into their lives despite the risk and uncertainty. We talked about Sarah constantly, comparing notes and filling in gaps in each other's knowledge, creating a more complete picture of who Sarah had been by combining our different perspectives and experiences. Rachel knew about Sarah's work life and her political beliefs and her fears about the future of the planet in ways I didn't, and I knew about her childhood and her family history and her early dreams in ways Rachel couldn't. And together we were building a fuller, richer understanding of this woman we had both loved and lost. One evening, about 2 months after our cemetery meeting, Rachel invited me to their apartment for dinner, and I walked into the home Sarah had shared with her and Oliver, seeing the space where my daughter had lived the last years of her life, and it was overwhelming in the best possible way. There were photos of Sarah everywhere, candid shots and professional portraits and silly selfies, documenting her life with Rachel and her pregnancy, and her brief time with infant Oliver. There were her books on the shelves, her coffee mugs in the kitchen, her jacket still hanging by the door because Rachel couldn't bring herself to give it away. And I touched these objects that Sarah had touched, sat on the couch where she had sat, and felt closer to her than I had felt since she died. Rachel showed me Oliver's nursery, the room Sarah had decorated with such care, with a mural of ocean creatures on one wall and a mobile of whales and dolphins hanging over the crib. And I could see my daughter's personality in every detail, her love of the ocean, her attention to beauty, her hope for the future despite all the environmental challenges she spent her days fighting. Oliver showed me his toys and his books and his special blanket that Rachel said had been Sarah's favorite, and he told me stories about his mama Rachel and his memories of his mommy Sarah, which were really Rachel's memories that Oliver had adopted as his own since he had been too young when Sarah died to remember her directly. We had dinner together, the three of us, and it felt achingly like family, like something Sarah would have wanted, like maybe we were honoring her memory by creating connection instead of letting grief and secrets keep us apart. Rachel told me she had been thinking about my role in Oliver's life, about what I wanted it to look like, and I admitted I didn't know. I just knew I wanted to be present, wanted to matter to him, wanted to be the grandmother I should have been from the beginning even if we were starting late. She suggested I could pick him up from school sometimes, could have him for sleepovers once we were all more comfortable, could be at his school events and birthday parties and all the ordinary moments of childhood. And I felt my eyes fill with tears because yes, that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted the privilege of being boring and reliable and consistently present in his life. Oliver, with the directness of children, asked if I would be his grandma forever, and I promised him I would. I would be his grandma for as long as I lived. I would love him and show up for him and tell him stories about his mother, and he seemed satisfied with this answer, going back to his dinner like we had just settled something important, and now could move on to more pressing matters, like whether he could have dessert. That night, driving home from their apartment, I thought about Sarah and the choices she had made, and the fear that had kept her silent, and I made peace with it in a way I couldn't have immediately after the cemetery revelation. She had been trying to protect everyone, herself and Rachel and Oliver and even me, from the messiness and uncertainty of complicated family dynamics. And while I wished she had trusted me enough to tell me the truth, I understood the fear that had kept her quiet. I thought about what Rachel had said about Sarah wanting to tell me, planning to tell me, and I wondered if she had been waiting for the right moment, if there had been a conversation she was building up to, a reveal she was planning that the accident had cut short. I would never know for sure, would never get to have that conversation with my daughter where she introduced me to Rachel and Oliver, and we worked through my initial shock and surprise to get to acceptance and love, but I could have that relationship now, could build what Sarah had wanted even if she wasn't here to see it. I started talking to Sarah in my head more than I had since right after her death, telling her about my days with Oliver, about my growing friendship with Rachel, about how I was trying to be the mother and grandmother she had needed me to be, and sometimes I imagined I could hear her responding, telling me she was proud, telling me she was happy we had found each other, telling me she loved me and always had even when she couldn't be fully honest. The anniversary of Sarah's death came around again, and this time I didn't go to the cemetery alone. Rachel and Oliver met me there, and we all brought flowers, creating a small garden at Sarah's headstone with our combined offerings. We stood together, three people bound by love and loss and the ongoing work of healing, and I felt Sarah's presence more strongly than I had in years. Felt like she was smiling at us, relieved that her fear hadn't kept us apart forever, grateful that we had found our way to each other despite her inability to bring us together while she was alive. Oliver talked to the headstone like Sarah could hear him, telling her about school and his friends and the cookies he had learned to make with me. And Rachel and I held hands, united in our grief and our commitment to honoring Sarah's memory by loving each other and this child who was the best part of both of us. I thought about how a year ago I had come to this grave alone and left alone, carrying my grief in solitude, and how different everything was now, how much richer and more complex and more painful, but also more beautiful. And I felt grateful for the stranger who had been weeping at my daughter's grave, grateful for the courage Rachel had shown in staying that day, grateful for the grandson I had discovered and the family I had gained even in the midst of loss. As we left the cemetery together, Oliver walking between Rachel and me, holding both our hands, I thought about the future and all the moments we would share, all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, all the opportunities to be the grandmother I wanted to be, to support Rachel as she continued the hard work of single parenting, to keep Sarah's memory alive through stories and photos and the love we showed her son. I thought about how grief transforms over time, how it makes space for new joy without diminishing the loss, how we can hold sorrow and happiness simultaneously, how love persists even when the person we love is gone. Sarah was still dead, still missing from every moment, still a hollow ache in my chest that would never completely heal. But she had also left us Oliver, left us each other, left us a reason to keep going and keep connecting and keep building family even in the ruins of what we had lost. I had spent 7 years thinking I knew everything about my daughter and her life and her death, and discovering I knew almost nothing had been devastating, but it had also been a gift, a chance to know her better through Rachel's eyes, a chance to meet my grandson, a chance to expand my definition of family to include the people Sarah had chosen, the people who had loved her in ways I never fully understood. I know some of you watching this might be thinking about secrets in your own families, about the things left unsaid, about the fear that keeps people from being fully honest with the people they love. Have you ever kept something important from your family because you were afraid of their reaction? Or have you discovered a secret about someone you loved that changed how you understood their whole life? I want you to know that whatever you're carrying, whatever truth you're afraid to share, the people who love you deserve the chance to surprise you, to show you that their love is bigger than their expectations, to meet you where you are instead of where they thought you would be. And if you're on the other side, if you're the person left behind trying to make sense of secrets and hidden lives, I want you to know that you can hold grief and anger and love all at once, that you can mourn what you lost while celebrating what you found, that it's possible to forgive someone even when you don't fully understand their choices. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced something similar, or if you have thoughts about family secrets and second chances, I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comments below. Your experiences matter, your perspective could help someone else who is struggling with similar issues, and I read every single comment because your stories and your support mean everything to me. And if this video touched your heart, if you felt the weight of this journey with me, I would be so grateful if you would hit that like button, because it helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it, who might be dealing with their own family complications and grief and unexpected discoveries. This is Through My Eyes, where we share real stories about real life, about the messy, complicated, beautiful, difficult journey of being human, and I would love for you to subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about loss and love and the ways life surprises us when we least expect it. Make sure you hit that notification bell too so you never miss a new story. And thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for taking this journey with me, for listening to my story, for holding space for the complexity of family and grief and the strange ways that endings can become beginnings. Until next time, remember that the people we love are more complicated than we ever know, that secrets usually come from fear rather than malice, that it's never too late to build bridges and create family and choose love over hurt, and that sometimes the most painful discoveries lead to the most beautiful transformations. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, take care of yourselves and the people you love, And don't be afraid to have the hard conversations before it's too late.